There is a story unfolding right now that almost nobody is connecting the way it should be connected. The President of the United States flew to Beijing this week with the chief executive of Boeing sitting in his delegation. From a state dinner inside the Great Hall of the People, Donald Trump went on Fox News and told Sean Hannity that Xi Jinping had just agreed to order 200 Boeing jets. 200. Boeing wanted 150. The president said they got 200. Now think about how that sentence is supposed to land. It is supposed to land as a triumph, as proof that the trip worked, as evidence that the world's two largest economies are talking again, that American manufacturing is back, that the man in the room knows how to close. And in the framing of the visit, that is exactly how it was sold. But within minutes of the announcement, Boeing's own stock fell almost 4%. Within an hour, Wall Street analysts who had been tracking this deal for months were on television explaining why a 200-jet order, what would be the largest single Chinese commitment to Boeing in nearly a decade, was being treated by the markets as a disappointment. And about 3,000 kilometers to the north, in a quiet town called Mirabel, just outside Montreal, the Canadian Prime Minister was watching the same news. Mark Carney had reason to watch it carefully. Because 8 days earlier, on a single afternoon in that same Quebec town, Carney had quietly signed the largest order for a Canadian-built commercial aircraft in the entire history of this country. Most coverage is treating these two stories as if they belong on different pages of the newspaper. They do not. This is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell, the ones hiding in plain sight, where the real shift is happening somewhere nobody is looking. If that sounds like the kind of analysis you want more of, sticking around and subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss what comes next. Now let's get into it. Here is what actually happened in Beijing. On the second day of his state visit, President Trump sat down for a televised interview with Fox News host Sean Hannity. He had spent the day in meetings with President Xi. He had attended a state banquet at the Great Hall of the People. And during the interview, he said this: Xi had agreed that very day to order 200 Boeing aircraft. He used the phrase 200 big ones. He repeated twice that Boeing had asked for 150 and that he had pushed the number to 200. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, had been signaling for days that a large Boeing order was coming. The Boeing chief executive, Kelly Ortberg, had personally flown with the president as part of a delegation that also included the CEOs of BlackRock, Tesla, and Goldman Sachs. This was, by any measure, the most concentrated assembly of American corporate power to visit Beijing in years. And the headline they wanted to bring home was Boeing. That is the official framing. The operational timeline tells a different story. For nearly a decade, Boeing has been effectively locked out of the Chinese market. The freeze began with the global grounding of the 737 MAX after 2 fatal crashes, and it deepened as trade tensions escalated through 3 successive presidential administrations. Between 2018 and the start of this year, Boeing delivered just over 100 aircraft to Chinese customers in total, roughly the same number of MAX jets that Chinese airlines accepted in a single year in 2018 alone. During that drought, Boeing's main competitor moved in. Airbus did not just take some of China's business. Airbus took almost all of it. In 2019, China's national aviation regulator placed a single order for 300 Airbus aircraft. Multiple large orders followed. By this year, Airbus had built a position in the Chinese market that aerospace analysts describe, without qualification, as dominant. China is on track to become the world's largest aircraft market within the next 20 years. Its commercial fleet is expected to roughly double to nearly 10,000 aircraft. Boeing being shut out of that market is not a quarterly problem. It is an existential one. So when reports began circulating earlier this year that Boeing and Beijing were negotiating a major package, the numbers discussed were enormous. Bloomberg reported in March that the deal could involve up to 500 narrow-body 737 MAX jets. Reuters reported similar figures sourced from industry insiders. The investment bank Jefferies modeled a potential order of 500 to 600 aircraft, with another roughly 100 wide-body jets on top of that. By the time the president's plane touched down in Beijing, prediction markets were assigning an 82% probability to a major Boeing announcement. The expectation was not whether, it was how big. 200 jets is a real number. By the standard of the last 8 years, it is a significant return to a market Boeing badly needs. But 200 jets is also less than half of what the market was modeling. And in the announcement Trump made on Fox News, the president did not specify which aircraft were included. He did not name the airlines that would take delivery. He did not say whether the agreement was a firm contract, a preliminary framework, or a political commitment that still needs to be turned into signed paperwork. He said 200 big ones. He said it was a lot of jobs. The market priced what the market saw. Boeing shares fell by roughly 4% in afternoon trading, their largest single-day decline in months. One U.S. senator publicly warned that China has, in his words, never lived up to one contract it has ever signed. The shares regained some ground by the close, but the message from professional investors was clear. The number was the headline, the details were missing, and the details are where deals like this either become real or quietly disappear. That is the first piece of the story. Now hold all of that against what happened in Quebec 8 days earlier, because the timing matters more than almost anyone has noticed. On the 6th of May, Mark Carney walked into a hangar at the Airbus Canada facility in Mirabel, just north of Montreal. He stood next to the Premier of Quebec, Christine Frechette. He stood next to the Chief Executive of Airbus's Commercial Aircraft Division, Lars Wagner. And he stood next to Tony Fernandez, the co-founder of AirAsia, one of the largest low-cost airline groups in Asia. In that hangar, they signed an order for 150 Canadian-made A220 jets with options for another 150. The list price value of the firm portion alone is approximately $19 billion US. Every single aircraft to be assembled in Mirabel, Quebec. It is the largest single firm order ever placed for the A220 program in its entire history, and it pushed the program past 1,000 total orders for the first time. Consider what that means in practice. The A220 traces its origins to Bombardier, the Quebec aerospace company that designed the aircraft, originally called the C-Series, before nearly going bankrupt and transferring the program to Airbus in 2018. The province of Quebec had invested $1 billion US into the program to keep Bombardier solvent. For years, the question hanging over Mirabel was whether the line could even survive. Airbus was producing only 7 or 8 A220s a month. The break-even rate was 14. Local economic development authorities had spent years quietly worrying about layoffs. This order changes that calculation completely. The AirAsia agreement gives Mirabel a backlog deep enough to anchor production into the 2030s. It locks in work for more than 4,600 Canadian aerospace workers. It supports more than 850 Canadian suppliers, from machine shops in the Laurentides region north of Montreal to engineering firms across the city. It transforms Mirabel from a program in doubt into one of the largest commercial aircraft success stories Canada has ever produced. Carney addressed Tony Fernandez directly at the ceremony. He thanked him for the trust being placed in Canadian workers in Quebec and Mirabel. He said Fernandez was choosing the best at exactly the right time. It was not a speech designed to make American headlines. It was a speech designed to make Canadian payrolls stable for the better part of a decade. It happened with almost no attention south of the border. Here is where I want to pause for a moment, because this is the part of the story that I think most people will have a strong reaction to. The question is not really whether 200 is bigger than 150. The question is what kind of number each of those is. One is a headline with details still to follow. The other is a signed contract with a delivery schedule, a named buyer, a named factory, and a named first quarter delivery date. And that distinction between a number announced on television and a number written into law is something that tends to get lost when the news cycle moves fast. I'm curious where you stand on this. Do you think the Boeing deal gets fully converted into firm contracts, or does it follow the pattern of past Chinese commitments that never quite materialized? Drop your read in the comments. This channel is genuinely better when the people watching it push back, add context, or catch something I missed. There is one more layer you need to understand. AirAsia is a Malaysian carrier. Malaysia, like much of Southeast Asia, sits inside the wider Chinese economic orbit. The A220 program in Mirabel is co-owned by Airbus and by the province of Quebec, which holds a 25% stake. The Mirabel line, the one that just received this $19 billion order, builds aircraft for customers across Asia and the rest of the world outside the United States. And the groundwork for that relationship was not laid last week. It was laid 4 months ago. In January of this year, Mark Carney became the first Canadian Prime Minister in nearly a decade to visit Beijing. He met with President Xi. He met with Premier Li Qiang. He signed a new strategic partnership covering trade, energy, and aerospace. In that agreement, China explicitly committed to welcoming Canadian investment in aerospace and advanced manufacturing. Carney came home with a preliminary deal on canola tariffs. Chinese duties on Canadian canola seed were scheduled to drop from a combined rate of roughly 85% down to approximately 15%, unlocking around $3 billion in Canadian export orders. He set a national target to increase Canadian exports to China by 50% by 2030. That visit happened 4 months before Donald Trump flew to Beijing with the Boeing chief executive in his delegation. Carney was there first. He met the same leaders. He signed papers in the same Great Hall. And he was there with a strategy that did not depend on a single press conference to define whether it had succeeded. Here is where the two stories intersect in a way that should concern anyone watching the global trade map being redrawn in real time. The standard framing of this week's news is that Donald Trump went to China and brought home a Boeing order. The standard framing of last week's news, to the extent it was reported in the United States at all, is that Airbus signed a deal with a Malaysian airline. Both framings miss what is actually happening. What is actually happening is that two North American governments are pursuing two completely different strategies for engaging with the Asian aviation market. And the early scoreboard is not what the headlines suggest. The American strategy is loud, transactional, and dependent on a single leader's ability to deliver a number on a stage. The Canadian strategy is quiet, structural, and tied to factories that already exist on Canadian soil, building aircraft that Canadian workers already know how to make. Consider the numbers side by side. 200 Boeing aircraft. Type unspecified. Value undisclosed. Contract status unclear. Announcement made through a television interview on a state visit. 150 A220 aircraft. Model specified. Value approximately $19 billion. Contract firm. Options for another 150. Signing ceremony held inside the Mirabel Assembly Facility. Formal press release issued by the Government of Canada, by Airbus, by AirAsia, and by the province of Quebec. The math does not resolve cleanly into the story the United States wanted to tell this week. The deeper point is this. When Boeing was shut out of China for nearly a decade, the global aviation industry did not wait. Airlines that needed narrow-body aircraft for Asian routes kept ordering. They ordered Airbus. They ordered the A320 family. They ordered the A220. They built fleets that depend on European and Canadian production lines. And those production lines did not sit idle waiting for American policy to stabilize. They expanded. They took the work. They built the relationships. There is a particular irony in the Mirabel story that deserves to be named. The aircraft now being assembled there, the A220, was originally a Canadian design. Bombardier developed it. Bombardier nearly went bankrupt building it. The province of Quebec poured $1 billion into the program to save it. And then in 2018, Bombardier handed the entire program to Airbus essentially for free. At the time, that transfer was treated in Canadian financial pages as a defeat. A Canadian company forced to surrender its best technology to a European competitor. 8 years later, that same program, now under European management, on a Canadian assembly line, with Canadian government equity, has just received the largest order in its history. The aircraft Canada once almost lost has become the aircraft Canada is now selling to the world. And that story is not over. With the AirAsia order in hand, Airbus is now seriously considering whether to launch a stretched version of the A220, an aircraft that would compete even more directly with Boeing's 737 MAX, the same aircraft Trump is now trying to sell to China. What the Trump administration is attempting to do is reverse a decade of lost ground in a single week of negotiations. The 200-jet announcement, if it is firmed up and delivered, will help. Boeing badly needs it. American aerospace workers badly need it. But it does not undo what happened during the years Boeing was absent. It does not unwind Airbus's dominance in Chinese deliveries. And it does not change the fact that on the other side of the same continent, Canada has spent the last 12 months quietly building a parallel strategy that is now starting to produce results. The Canadian approach to China under Carney has been described by his own government as pragmatic, interest-based, and aimed at strategic autonomy. Canada continues to maintain tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Canada continues to coordinate with allies in the Indo-Pacific on maritime security. Carney is scheduled to travel to India, Australia, and Japan in the coming months. The Canadian engagement with Beijing is not a romance. It is a recalculation conducted in coordination with a broader middle power network rather than in isolation from it. The American approach this week was different. It was bilateral, transactional, and personal. There is nothing inherently wrong with that. Bilateral engagement can break logjams. Direct summits can unlock things that years of bureaucratic process cannot. But the durability of what gets built is determined not by the announcement, but by the paperwork that follows it. A strategic partnership announced months in advance, a series of trade frameworks layered on top of it, a major aircraft order signed inside a working factory. That is considerably harder to undo than a number delivered through a television camera at a state dinner. What comes next is the question neither government is yet answering publicly. Boeing still has to convert Trump's announcement into a firm contract. Chinese state airlines still have to decide which aircraft models they will actually accept, on which delivery schedule, at what price. The deal could be confirmed in the coming weeks. It could be quietly revised downward. Or it could follow the path of the January 2020 commitment, when Beijing pledged to purchase $77 billion in U.S. goods, including aircraft, and then never followed through after the pandemic hit. The history of large Chinese commitments to Boeing is a history of headlines that did not always survive contact with the next political cycle. Meanwhile, in Mirabel, the first AirAsia A220 is scheduled for delivery in the first quarter of 2028. The assembly line is running. The supply chain is moving. The Quebec government is already revising its growth projections. That order is not waiting for a press release. It is already at work. You remember the world we used to live in, where America led, Canada followed, and the major announcements shaping global aviation came out of Washington or Chicago, not out of Ottawa or Montreal. That world is changing, not because Canada is louder. It is changing because Canada is quieter, and the work it has been doing quietly is starting to produce results that the loud version of American statecraft cannot match. 200 Boeing jets. Terms to be announced. 150 A220s. Terms already signed. The contrast tells you almost everything you need to know about how the next decade of North American economic strategy is going to be fought, and where the weight is most likely to land. If this story made you think differently about something you thought you already understood, that is what this channel is for. There is a lot more where this came from, and the subscribe button and the bell are the simplest way to make sure the next one finds you. Either way, thank you for watching this one all the way through. It genuinely means something that you did.